I was wrong about my son-in-law, not wrong the way you're wrong about a football team or a weather forecast. Wrong in the way that costs you sleep, costs you years, costs you the quiet dignity you spent a lifetime building. I thought he was just ambitious. I thought my daughter had chosen a man who pushed hard because he wanted to provide for her. I made excuses for him the way fathers do the way I did. Anyway, because I loved her more than I trusted my own instincts. His name is Dominic. And for 3 years after my wife passed, he made my life smaller than it had any right to be. Let me start from the beginning. Because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand who I was before it happened and who I became after. I grew up in Ballarat. Third of 5 kids, father worked at the gasworks. Mum did alterations from the kitchen table. We weren't poor in the way people mean when they want sympathy. We had food, we had school shoes. We had enough, but there was never anything left over. You learned early that money was a thing you chased, not a thing that came to you. I carried that with me my whole life, even after it stopped being true. I met my wife, I'll call her Joan, because that was her name, and she deserves to be named properly at a dance in Geelong in 1984. She was 22. I was 24. She laughed at something her friend said before I even introduced myself, and I thought, that's it. That's the sound I want in my house for the rest of my life. We were married within the year. We built things slowly, the way people did back then. I started as a storeman at a hardware distributor in the western suburbs of Melbourne. By my mid-30s, I'd moved into logistics management. By 45, I'd bought into the business with 2 partners, men I'd known for 15 years, men I trusted completely. We expanded. We made quiet, careful decisions. We didn't flash it around. Joan still clipped grocery catalogs from the letterbox until she was in her 60s, because old habits don't vanish just because circumstances change. We drove sensible cars. We lived in the same house in Altona North that we'd bought in 1991 and renovated twice. Nobody knew what we had. That was how we preferred it. Our daughter, I'll call her Steph, was born in 1988. She was the center of everything, the way an only child often is. Joan and I poured into her without reservation. Education, travel, opportunities we'd never had. She was bright, genuinely bright, and funny in that dry way her mother had. For a long time, I thought we'd done it right. She met Dominic at a work function when she was 34. He was 37, worked in commercial real estate, dressed well, and spoke confidently about things he'd read in magazines. I noticed that about him early, the way he quoted things just slightly ahead of knowing them, like a man who'd memorized the menu but hadn't eaten yet. Joan liked him well enough at first. She said he had good energy. I think she was being generous. The first time he came to the house, he walked through the living room, and I watched his eyes do a slow calculation. The furniture was comfortable but old. The carpet had been replaced once since 1991, but it wasn't new. The kitchen had good appliances, but the benchtops were laminate. He smiled at everything, but his smile had a kind of patient tolerance in it, like a man waiting for something better to arrive. He married Steph in 2024. Small ceremony. Nice venue. Joan was sick by then. The cancer had come back for the 2nd time, and she tired easily, but she dressed beautifully and danced with me after dinner for longer than the doctor would have approved. I have a photo of her from that night on the bedside table. She's laughing at something off camera. I have no idea what. I look at it most mornings. Joan died 14 months after the wedding. February. The kind of Melbourne February that makes you feel like the city is trying to push you indoors permanently. I took it badly. Worse than I'd expected. And I thought I'd been preparing myself for years. Grief doesn't work the way you plan for it. You think you've mapped the territory, and then you arrive there and realize the map was just your imagination. Dominic came to the funeral with the right face on. He shook hands correctly, said the right things, stood close to Steph in a way that looked supportive. I was grateful for it at the time. I was grateful for everything that day that didn't make me feel worse. Things shifted about 6 weeks later. Small things first. Dominic started calling more often than usual, not to ask how I was, exactly, but to raise topics. The house. Whether I'd thought about downsizing now that it was just me, whether I'd spoken to a financial advisor about restructuring things, he framed it all as concern. He was very good at framing things as concern. I'd say I was managing fine. He'd say, "Of course you are. But have you thought about?" And then the sentence would go somewhere I hadn't invited it. He started calling me mate in a way that felt slightly different from how Australians usually mean it, a little more pointed, a little more from above. By the middle of that year, Steph and Dominic had started coming around for Sunday lunches. I cooked. Joan had been the better cook, but I'd always managed a roast, and it felt important to keep the table going. The first few weeks were fine. Then Dominic started doing this thing where he'd look around the room during conversation and comment on things. Not rudely, he was never bluntly rude. But there was a quality to it. He'd say something like, "You know, I was talking to a mate who sold in this suburb last year, got a remarkable price," as if it were just conversation. He'd mention friends who'd moved their parents into retirement villages and how much happier everyone was. He had a way of inserting ideas into the air without appearing to be the one who'd put them there. I let it pass. I'm 63. I know how to let things pass. But then one Sunday, it would have been September, the jasmine was coming through on the back fence. He arrived and sat down at my kitchen table and said it plainly. Steph was in the bathroom. He sat across from me with a cup of tea and said, "I think it's time to have an honest conversation about what comes next for you." I said, "I'm doing well. Thanks for asking." He said, "We think the house is too big for you now. We think you'd be better somewhere more suited to your stage of life." I said, "My stage of life," he said. "Somewhere with support around you. A proper facility. You're 63. You've been through a rough year. And frankly, it's a lot to manage alone." I looked at him. I thought about the first time I'd seen his eyes do that slow calculation in my living room. I thought about how he'd moved through this house for 3 years, like a man waiting for it to become available. I said, "I'm 63, Dominic. I run 5 kilometers 3 times a week. I've got a full license, a full diary, and a full pantry. I think I'm right where I should be." He smiled. The patient smile. He said, "We just want what's best for you." Steph came back from the bathroom and sat down, and I looked at her and I waited to see what she'd do. She looked at the table. She said, "Dad, Dom's just trying to help. It might be worth thinking about." I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, a Rosella landed on the back fence and looked in through the glass, then left. I thought about Joan saying, "I want to hear that laugh in my house for the rest of my life." I thought about Steph at 7 years old asleep on the couch with her school shoes still on. I thought about how much can be lost in a sentence. I said, "I'll think about it." I didn't think about it. I called my solicitor the following morning. Peter had handled my affairs for 20 years. He knew everything, the structure of the partnership, the property portfolio, the shareholdings, all of it. I told him about the conversation. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always paid him for. He said, "Let's make sure everything's in order then." We met twice over the following 3 weeks. We restructured the trust. We updated the terms. We made the ownership of the business interests and the investment properties clear in a way that required no interpretation, no contest, and no goodwill from anyone who might not have my interests at heart. Peter handled it quietly and efficiently, as he always had. I didn't tell Steph. I didn't tell Dominic. I just made sure that whatever they thought was coming to them, and whatever they thought they understood about my circumstances, was no longer the map of the territory. The lunches continued. I kept cooking the roasts. Dominic kept doing his thing with the comments and the suggestions. Steph kept looking at the table at the moments when I needed her to look at me. I let it all pass. I kept running my 5 kilometers. I kept going to work 3 days a week. Because I liked the work and I liked the people. And I had no intention of pretending to be older or more diminished than I was. In October, I went to a business dinner annual thing, logistics industry, held at a hotel in the CBD. I'd been going for 15 years. I ran into a journalist there. A woman who covered business and finance for a national outlet. We'd met briefly at one of these dinners before. She asked about the company, what we were planning, whether we'd considered any significant expansion. She wrote it up in a short profile piece, not front page, not especially prominent, just a business profile. It mentioned the partnership by name, mentioned the size of the operation, mentioned my name. I didn't think much of it. I read it on a Thursday morning over toast and thought, that's fairly accurate. Good. And then I went about my day. The following Sunday, Dominic and Steph came for lunch. I'd made lamb, rosemary and garlic, the way Joan used to do it. I was carrying plates to the table when my nephew, Steph's cousin, 26, brilliant kid, studying engineering in Adelaide, rang the doorbell. He'd been in Melbourne for a conference and wanted to drop in. I was glad to see him. I set an extra place. His name is Connor. He's the kind of young person who makes you feel the future might actually be all right. He sat down, pulled out his phone to show me something about his research, and then he stopped. He looked at the screen. He looked at me. He said, "Uncle Neville." And that's what he called me. Uncle Neville. Which is my name. He said, "Uncle Neville, is this you?" He handed me the phone. It was the article. The photo they'd used was from the company's website. But Connor had found something else. A longer piece in a finance newsletter, one I hadn't seen, that had picked up the original article and expanded on it. Listed figures. Put context around them. Made the picture quite clear. Dominic was sitting across the table. He couldn't see the screen from where he was sitting. I handed the phone back to Connor and said, "Yes, that's me. We can talk about it later." Connor, who is 26 and has not yet learned all the reasons why adults sometimes want to change the subject, said, "But that's enormous. You never said," I said. "Lamb's gonna get cold, mate." Steph was looking at me now. Not at the table. At me. Something had moved in her face that I hadn't seen in a long time. Something younger. Something that looked like the girl who used to fall asleep on the couch with her school shoes on. Dominic said, "What is it? What's the article?" Connor glanced between us and finally, bless him, understood that he had walked into something. He said, "Just a business thing. Sorry. Wrong time." And he put the phone away. But it was already out. The air in the room had changed the way it changes when something true has entered it. After lunch, Connor left early. He felt bad. I could tell. And I squeezed his shoulder at the door and told him not to worry. Dominic and Steph stayed to help clear the table. Dominic was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Usually his silences were calculated, full of whatever he was preparing to say next. This silence was something else. He said eventually that article Connor was reading. "Is that about your business?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Those numbers?" I said, "Fairly accurate, yes." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You never mentioned." I said, "I suppose it never came up." There was a look that crossed his face, then not quite embarrassment, not quite shame, more like a man recalculating something very quickly and not enjoying the result. He looked at Steph. She was looking at the floor. He said, "We didn't realize." I said, "No. I imagine you didn't." I stacked the last of the plates. I carried them to the kitchen. When I came back to the dining room, Dominic was standing near the window looking at the backyard. And Steph was sitting at the table with her hands folded. She said, "Dad, I waited." She said, "I'm sorry. I should have. I should have stood up for you more." When Dom said what he said about the facility, I shouldn't have let that happen. I sat down across from her. Outside, the jasmine on the back fence had gone over, the way it does at the end of spring, and the yard looked a bit emptier for it. I thought about Joan planting that jasmine in 1997, the year we finally saved enough to do the back garden properly. I thought about how she'd be furious with Steph right now, and how she'd also find a way to let her back in, because that was the kind of woman she was. I said, "I know you're sorry." She said, "I let him talk me into things. I let him tell me things about you that weren't true, that you were struggling, that you needed managing." I said, "Why did you let him do that?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know. I think I stopped looking clearly. I think I let someone else's version of things become mine." It's a hard thing to hear from your child. It's also, I'll admit, a relief. Dominic came back from the window. He sat down. He was a different version of himself than the one who'd sat across from me in September and told me I needed a facility suited to my stage of life. Something had been deflated. I didn't take pleasure in it exactly, but I noticed it. He said, "I want to say something." I waited. He said, "I've been out of line. With the house. With the suggestions. It wasn't my place." I said, "No. It wasn't." He said, "I didn't understand the situation." I said, "The situation is that I'm a 63-year-old man who lost his wife and who has been running a business for 20 years and who is not done yet. That's the situation. It was always the situation." He nodded. He didn't say anything else. They left an hour later. I stood at the front door and watched their car until it turned the corner. I went back inside and sat in the kitchen. I looked at the chair where Joan used to sit with her morning tea, the one with the slightly worn armrest on the left side where she rested her elbow when she read. I sat there for a while. Over the following months, things shifted. Not immediately, not dramatically. Real life doesn't tend to work that way. But Dominic's manner changed. The patient smile went somewhere. He stopped making suggestions. He asked questions instead of arriving with answers. It was different. Steph and I had a long conversation on the phone one evening in December. A real conversation. The kind we'd stopped having for a while, without either of us quite noticing. She told me things about the marriage that I hadn't known, about the pressure she'd felt, about the version of her father that Dominic had slowly painted over the one she actually knew. It was hard to hear. It was also, I think, the beginning of something coming back. Connor visited again at Christmas. He apologized properly for the lunch incident. I told him he'd done nothing wrong, that sometimes things need to come out one way or another, and that lamb was going to get cold whether we talked about business or not. He laughed. He's a good kid. The trust remains in order. Connor is named. Steph is named too, because she is my daughter, and she carries her mother's laugh. And I am not the kind of man who punishes people for growing through hard things. Dominic is not named. That's not punishment either. That's just clarity. I still live in the house in Altona North. I still run my 5 kilometers. The jasmine grows back every spring without being asked to. It just does what it's always done, same as me. I think about Joan every day. I think about the dance in Geelong, the sound of her laugh, the way she planted things in the garden with genuine faith that she'd be there to see them grow. She was right, mostly, except for the end, which none of us gets to plan. I've been asked by a few people since the story got around, because these things do get around, whether I'm angry, whether I feel betrayed, whether I wish I'd said more, done more, confronted it harder. I don't, honestly. What I feel mostly is clear. Clearer than I've felt in years. There's something about being tested, about someone looking at what you've built and deciding it's theirs before you're finished with it, that strips everything down to what actually matters. You find out who sees you, and who only sees what might be transferred. Dominic saw a quiet old man in a house with laminate benchtops and didn't look past that. That was his mistake to make. I didn't need to correct it loudly. I just needed to make sure that when the real picture appeared, everything was already in order. Joan always said the quietest people in a room are the ones who've already done the maths. I don't know where she got that from. But she was right, as she so often was. If you're in a similar position, and I know some of you are, because I hear from you, and your stories are not so different from mine, I'd say this. Don't wait for the confrontation to get your affairs in order. Do it quietly. Do it early. Do it with a professional you trust, before anyone has reason to contest it. The time to build the fence is before the cattle get out, as my father used to say. Don't confuse a person's silence with weakness. The people who aren't explaining themselves, who aren't defending themselves, who just keep going about their lives with their 5-kilometer runs and their Sunday roasts, they're often the ones who've already thought it through and made their decisions. They're not waiting for your permission. And don't close the door on the people you love for the mistakes they made under someone else's influence. That doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean skipping the hard conversation, but it means understanding that people can be walked away from themselves gradually. And sometimes, given enough room and enough honesty, they can find their way back. My daughter found her way back. I'm glad for it. The house in Altona North is warm in December. The jasmine's coming in again on the back fence. And some mornings, when the light comes through the kitchen window the way it used to when Joan sat with her elbow on the worn armrest, I almost feel like everything is arranged the way it was always supposed to be. Not the same. Different. But arranged. That's enough. Most days, that's everything. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened. Not obsessively, I'm not that kind of person. But quietly. The way you think about things when you're out running in the early morning, and there's nobody else around, and the streets are still. What I keep coming back to is this. Dominic didn't do what he did because he was especially cruel. He did it because he looked at me and saw what he expected to see. A tired man in an old house with laminate benchtops. A man who'd recently lost his wife and probably his bearings. A man who could be guided toward a decision that happened to suit someone else. He didn't invent that version of me. He just never looked past it. That's what happens when you let assumptions do the work that observation should be doing. You stop seeing the person in front of you, and you start managing the idea of them instead. And the idea of a 63-year-old widower rattling around a house in Altona North was, to Dominic, something to be resolved. Efficiently. Preferably in a way that moved certain assets in a certain direction. The thing is, I understand it. I don't excuse it. But I understand how a person gets there. You tell yourself about. You tell yourself you're helping. You rearrange your intentions so they look like concern. You use words like facility and stage of life and support structure because they sound responsible rather than what they actually are. And if the person you're doing it to is quiet and patient and doesn't fight back immediately, you start to believe you were right about them all along. What Dominic never accounted for was that quiet and passive are not the same thing. I've been quiet my whole life. I built everything I built quietly. Joan used to say that the loudest person in any room is usually the one with the least to protect. She was right about most things. I think about Steph a lot. About how she got to the point where she sat at my table and looked at the floor when she should have looked at me. That didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually. The way most damage does, one small concession at a time. One story accepted without questioning. One version of her father slowly painted over the one she actually knew. I don't blame her for it. But I think about it because I want to understand it clearly enough to make sure I see it if it ever starts happening again. What she did at that dining table in December, saying sorry, saying it plainly without hedging, that took something. It's easy to imagine that apologies are the easy part after the hard part is over. They're not. Admitting that you let someone else's voice replace your own judgment is a genuinely hard thing to say out loud. I respect her for it. If there's anything in this story worth carrying away, it's not about money or property or legal structures, though those things matter, and I'd encourage anyone in a similar position to get them in order sooner rather than later. It's about not letting someone else's limited version of you become the version you accept for yourself. Dominic's mistake was assuming I was done. My job was simply to keep going, keep running, keep working, keep cooking the Sunday roast, and let the facts speak when they were ready to. The jasmine on the back fence doesn't ask permission to grow back each spring. It just does what it's always done. I've decided that's a reasonable way to live.